One of the oldest and most respected books of the Bible may, in fact, be misunderstood, or even accused of something it never intended to be. The Book of Job has been called cruel, cold, and even evil by readers shocked by its story of extreme loss, family deaths, and a disturbing divine silence. After all, how can one reconcile faith with such suffering without easy answers? Is the problem in the text, or in the way we, centuries later, read it with haste, pain, and modern expectations? You will discover the historical context behind this work, understand why it was written, what it actually claims, and especially what it does not say, besides perceiving how this ancient narrative still echoes in our current crises, in grief, injustice, and the search for meaning. When reading the Book of Job, many people get stuck precisely at the most sensitive point of the story, the death of Job's 10 children, and the fact that, in the end, he has 10 children again. At first glance, it sounds almost cruel, as if human lives could be exchanged, replaced, or compensated, just like material goods. This discomfort is not born only from hasty or skeptical readings. It also sprouts within religious communities, from fathers, mothers, and sincere readers who know the real weight of grief. After all, losing a child is not like losing a house or a herd, and no one who has gone through it would say life goes on without shuddering inside. This moral discomfort is so strong that many conclude, bluntly, there is something wrong here. Criticism often says that the text portrays a God indifferent to human pain, who allows extreme tragedies and then offers a cold, almost mathematical solution. However, this reading, although emotionally understandable, may be skipping important stages of the text itself and the historical context in which it was written. Even before any theological debate, there is a simple and universal fact. Grief does not obey the logic of exchange. Psychologists like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, known for her studies on grief in the 20th century, show that the loss of a loved one reorganizes a person's entire life, leaving marks that do not disappear with time. In ancient and modern cultures, from the Middle East to today's Brazil, the death of a child is treated as a definitive rupture of normality. No one replaces a person, because human bonds do not function like replacement parts, and common sense already understands this without needing theory. Therefore, when religious readings suggest, even unintentionally, that new children resolve a previous loss, something sounds deeply wrong. Well-intentioned phrases like "you can have others" usually hurt more than they console, precisely because they ignore the uniqueness of each relationship. Curiously, the Book of Job itself never describes Job as someone who overcame the death of his children, nor does it minimize his pain. On the contrary, the text preserves his laments, his silence, and his confusion. And this detail presents an important turn. Perhaps the problem is not in the human experience of grief, but in the way we are reading what the text actually claims. When the emotional dust settles a bit, a disconcerting question arises. Does the text say what so many claim it says? A careful reading of the Book of Job shows something curious. At no point does the explicit idea of exchange or replacement of children appear. The vocabulary used at the end of the book speaks of restoration, blessing, and prosperity, terms common in the wisdom literature of the ancient Near East. Similar texts found in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt also describe restorative endings, without suggesting that human losses were erased. In other words, the narrative follows a known literary pattern, but with nuances that many modern readers end up ignoring. This distinction changes everything, because it reveals that part of the accusation against the book may be born more from our reading than from the author's intention. By projecting a cold logic of compensation onto the text, we risk distorting its central message. Job does not celebrate the past as if nothing had happened, nor does the text suggest that his pain was nullified by new events. On the contrary, the silence about any replacement seems intentional, almost like a break for simplistic interpretations, and when we realize this, it becomes clear that there are still deeper layers hidden in the details. To understand this difference, think of something very human. A woman who loses her husband after many years of marriage. Years later, with her heart still marked, she marries again. The new relationship can be true, deep, and even healing, without ever erasing the love lived before. No one in their right mind would say that the second husband replaced the first, because human stories do not work like spreadsheets of losses and gains. This logic, moreover, is recognized in sociological and psychological studies on affective bonds, which show how new relationships coexist with old memories instead of nullifying them. This analogy helps to illuminate what is at stake in the Book of Job. The narrative does not suggest that what came after erases what was lost, but that something new can emerge without denying the previous pain. Blessing here does not mean emotional amnesia or mathematical correction of the past. On the contrary, the story seems to insist that certain losses remain part of the identity of those who suffer, even when life begins to flourish again. At the beginning of the narrative, the Book of Job lists with almost accounting precision everything Job possessed: herds, servants, and 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. At the end, when the story describes the restoration, something curious happens. Sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys appear in exactly double the amount. This pattern of duplication is not accidental. It follows a clear literary logic, common in ancient texts that speak of full restoration. But suddenly, this careful mathematics stops at a specific point. When it comes to children, the number does not double. Job ends the story with the same total: 7 sons and 3 daughters. If the text were defending the idea of replacement, the internal logic would call for 20 children, not 10. This apparent error, far from being an oversight, sounds like an intentional choice by the author. It is as if the text raised its hand and said in silence, "Children do not fall into the same category as goods." And when this realization hits, the question is no longer, why did God replace them? But why did the author refuse to double precisely what hurts the most? From this detail, many ancient and modern interpreters begin to see another layer of the narrative. In the view presented by the Book of Job itself, the children who died are not treated as erased from existence, but as absent for a time. In ancient Hebrew thought, death was not seen as annihilation, but as a real, though mysterious, separation. Later biblical texts, such as the Psalms and the Prophets, reinforce this hope of continuity of life before God. Thus, the count changes completely. Job does not end with only 10 children, but with the expectation of 10 in eternity and 10 more living under his eyes. This reading does not try to soften the pain, nor transform tragedy into a religious formula. It simply respects the internal logic of the text and the horizon of faith in which it was written. The final restoration does not undo the previous suffering, but points to something greater than the immediate present. It is a hope that does not scream, does not solve everything, but whispers that death does not have the last word. And when this idea fits, the narrative stops seeming cold or cruel and starts to provoke something deeper, an uncomfortable but persistent trust that still needs to be confronted with the harsh reality of human suffering. Therefore, the Book of Job does not offer easy answers to suffering, and perhaps that is precisely its greatest value. The text does not explain why evil happens, nor does it deliver a formula to avoid pain, but points to something deeper: trust in the midst of chaos. Throughout the story, Job never receives a complete explanation, only an encounter, and that changes everything. This logic crossed centuries and influenced Jewish and Christian thinkers who saw in the book an anticipation of the idea that pain is not an automatic sign of guilt. Suffering here is not a mathematical punishment, it is part of the human mystery. This hope finds an echo in the present, in hospitals, cemeteries, and silent houses where people still try to understand irreparable losses. The book does not deny the crying, does not rush the healing, and does not romanticize the tragedy. It invites the reader to trust even when they do not understand, something that later connects, for Christians, to the figure of Christ and the unjust suffering lived on the cross. Far from being evil, Job remains uncomfortable, honest, and deeply human. And perhaps the final question is not whether the book is cruel, but whether we are prepared to face a text that refuses to lie about the pain and yet dares to speak of hope.